So in this lesson, we are connecting to the Open Trivia database. There's a lot of options to get some robust questions, and we're generating an interactive web application where the user can select how many questions they want to run with, hit Start Game, and then it's going to provide the question content on the page, and they can select from all of this information that's came in from the JSON data. So we're dynamically generating the question, also buttons for the possible answers. So when these get clicked, we get a response whether it was right or wrong, and then the next question option also shows up. So again, we can select next question and move through the quiz questions, and we've got all of the functionality. We still need to do some debugging and troubleshooting, so that's going to be coming up in part 2. So this lesson, we're building the basic structure of the trivia database application. This lesson, we're starting with the same base HTML template that we have in the earlier lessons. We've got the HTML index page, title, style, tag, so we can apply some styling to the page content, and then also the 4 default HTML elements that we're going to use in order to interact with the JavaScript to construct the page content and the dynamic content and interactions for the user. Linking out to app9.js, we've created an app9.js file. This selects the 4 HTML elements from the page so that they're ready to use. Also, we've kept the add event listener, the DOM content, loaded. So if we want to load some content directly on the page, whenever the DOM content is loaded, that's available as well. And then the button also has the event listener, so that's ready to go. So when we click the button, we're having the event listener function and fire off. So this lesson, we are going to be opening up and using the OpenTDB.com. So it's an open trivia database, and it's free to use. It's user contributed trivia questions. You can add new questions, you can browse the questions, and the nice thing about this website is that it's got a nice robust API that you can interact with. So they have under the tab here at the top right hand side, if you click the API, it can generate the API URL. So it's got number of questions. There's also the categories, the difficulty, the selection type, and then coding, so the different encodings that we want to use. And then that allows us to generate a URL and then post that URL into the browser, and you can see that we're generating the questions. And these are randomly generated questions, so they are also changing as we refresh the content. So if we want 10 questions, we can structure the API endpoint as needed and then just create the question base, the question URL from the parameters here that are listed. And the parameters are making a request to the particular endpoint. And you can also see that if we specify a category, the category values are by 9. So if we select a category from the drop-down list, that will change the category. We can also select the difficulty, so that will set the difficulty. We can also select the type of questions. And now our web URL has the amount, which is the number of questions, the category, so we've got a listing of a number of different categories that we can select to, difficulty as well, and the type, so multiple choice or even true or false. So we can generate multiple different types of questions and have this type of interface for the users as well. So let's start building this application. And we've got our basic content is loaded, so we want to provide the user the option for launching the game. So setting up the button, and I'm going to update this button value to, so the input will dictate how many questions, and then also we're going to have a button value here, and this is going to start the game. So let's update the content of the button, and this will just be text content. And within the text content, this is where we can type the start the game option for the user. So the user sees that this is the game that they want to launch. And then also for the input value, we're going to change this to set attribute and the type of attribute that we're going to update this is going to be to a number. So this way they can go up and down for the numbers of questions. So whatever number of questions we've got within the input, that will update. Also, let's set a default value for the questions. So the default value will be 10. And then we're ready to start the game. So clicking the Start Game button, this is going to launch into the game, and this is where we want to generate the page content within the output area. So instead of just having ready, we want to launch to the web URL. So start by creating the base URL, and I'll just call this base URL, as this is going to be what our base URL is that we're going to use. And you can keep the question mark in there, as we're going to add the parameters. And I'll also select the full parameters here and copy it so we have something to reference. So we can see that the amount is equal to, and that should equal the number of questions we want there. So let's update that within the web URL. So temp URL, and we're going to start by setting it as the base URL and then adding to it, so concatenating to it. So we already have the question mark, so we just need to add in the amount. And the amount that we're going to be using is going to be whatever amount we've got within the input value. So that's going to be coming from the input field. And we'll also update the categories afterwards. So for now, we just want to make sure that we can start by creating our request and get the data that we can then use in order to generate the content. So this is just our initial setup of the fetch request. So now we've got a URL that we can use, and you can also log that out into the console just to make sure that this is the URL that we want to use. And we can click it to make sure it opens up in the browser. And once that does, then you should be fairly certain that you can make the fetch request. So let's, and we'll call this populate page. So whatever the URL is, and then passing in the temp URL. So make it dynamic into different functions so that we have the flexibility to have different functions call over to the page, the population of the page with different URL endpoints. So we can update this, we can have links, and having all of that being passed in as the base URL that it's connecting to. So now let's make the fetch request. So fetch request is going over to the URL, and then promise based, so the response object returning back as response JSON. And I just want to note that you might have noticed that sometimes I'll wrap this within quotes and sometimes I'll wrap this within the curly brackets. So it depends on how you want to write the code. If you have more content here within the returned object, then you do need to include return. But by default, so you do need to write it this way. If by default you're just returning it back, then you don't need the curly brackets, you don't need to write return, and this is the shortest format for returning back the JSON object. Then next up, we're getting the data content. And it just saves a little bit of time. Instead of having to wrap it with the curly brackets, you can just leave out the, or rounded brackets, you can just leave those out. And this is just depending on your preference of writing the code. So let's see what happens. So we get our response object, and everything comes back within the results array. So that means that, and there's nothing else here within the response code. So within the results array, this is the array of content that we want to output to the page. So we want to iterate through this content and output it to the page. So let's set that up and create a function in order to output to page. So call a function output page, and this is just requiring the data array of content. And this actually does need to be an array, so you can also give the variable names more specific names to indicate what we're expecting. So that is expecting an array. So once we get that array, we can then loop through the array of contents and return back the elements of each one of those. So these are each one of the items that we have that are being returned back within that array. And from there, and I didn't actually send it over to this function, so let me update the console message to output. And at this point now we can see that we've got the JSON, the JavaScript object, and we can update, so we can specify the category, and we've got the incorrect answers, the correct answers, and question. So from here we can build out the interface for the user to interact with these questions. So what we also want to do with these questions is we want to load this into a global object so that we can reference that question base and use that and generate the quiz for the user and also track their progress. So let's create a global game object, and within the game object we can have values like the questions, so this can just be an array. And when we do load the results, we can populate it into the array. So selecting, instead of outputting it to the page, let's pass it into the game object. So game and queue. And equal that to the data results. And then we can launch the page output. We don't need to pass in the data results. And then this can just be coming from here where we're ready to output it to the page. And from here we can console log the game questions. And let's comment this out. So do a toggle of the block of comments, as we don't need to loop through them anymore. So we've populated the questions, and this is whenever the game starts. So this button starts the game, and we're going to hide the input as well as the button object, so button 1. So style and display, and equal that to none. So it's going to hide the button. And also we're going to hide the input value. So input style, and also display, and set that to none. So that can hide from the screen. And that means that we're ready to launch into the game. Let's select the question. So we're going to start with question 0 and using the index value for the questions. And when we output to the page, then we're going to output whatever the game question value is and index value that. So depending on whatever the current page is, that's what we can output to the screen. And then taking this value, and we'll increment it by 1, so that will allow us to the next time to move to the next question within the object. And we don't need to make another fetch request because we've already preloaded our game question array with all of the questions that we want to use for this round in the game. So we're not making any other fetch requests, we're just taking the data and we're generating the quiz according to the content. So let's also update the H1 and update the text content. And this is going to take the input value and value, questions, and just in case it's 1, selected, so the user can see that there's some type of action that's being taken place. So 10 questions selected, and output the question content onto the page. So let's set this up as our question object, and then increment it to move to next question. And then we'll take care of the conditions afterwards to ensure that we don't move to the next question if there is no question available. So within the game question itself, we want to now output it to the page. So let's see what we have to work with. We want to build an array with answers. So let answers, and that's going to be an array. And we're building the answers with the incorrect answers array first. So using the current, and now that we're referencing it as question, it's a lot easier. So setting the answers as the questions. And then also we want to add to it the incorrect or the correct answer as well. So take the answers and push into it the question correct answer value. And that's correct underscore answer. So this is all of the options for the questions that we have. Let's also still output the question content so that we can break apart the object information. So this is the question content. So we've got category. We also have the type as multiple choice. And then we've got the question itself. So let's start outputting the elements to the page. And we'll create a function that's going to generate the content, the node. So this is going to be a function that we can use in order to create the elements and then append it to the parent. So we need the parent option in the arguments as well as the element that we want to use. And if there's other parameters, then we could add those in afterwards. So within this function, we're going to create the element. So this is basically the element type. And maybe we can be specific with L type. And then we're just going to append it to the parent. So using the document create element and creating according to the element type that's been listed within the generate element attribute. And also maybe we also want to have output or contents. I'll just call it contents. And then temp. And I'm going to set it as inner HTML, just in case we want to provide some inner HTML for the contents. Or even better yet than contents, let's name this HTML. So this will just automatically populate the contents of the element that we're creating with HTML. And then using the parent object, append the temp object. And then we can also return back the temp object. So that way, that's our quick generator for the objects. And let's try it out the first time. So set up. So this is our main holder div. So the parent of this is going to be the output object. And we also want to clear output. So update the inner HTML of output to clear that content out. And the element type, so this is just going to be a div element type. And then the contents of it are just going to be blank right now. So we're not going to have any content added in. And actually, let's write test into the content to see how that works. So that's our main container element that we're going to use to add in the contents. And this is where we can append the questions. So one of the elements that we need is we need a question. And I'll just call it Q1. And we'll generate the element content. So applying it to the main div and generating as a div. And we want to output whatever the question. So this is going to be question, since we've named our object question as well. The content is going to be question, question. as we're trying to access the question that's contained there. So there's our question being output. And then we also want to output all of the possible options. So let's select the answers array, and we're logging that out. So using a for each, looping through each one of the options, and let's call it opt. We're going to construct using the same format, so using our constructor, and I'll just call it opt1. We're going to be appending it to the main div. We can also create another question type div. So actually, let's do that. So this main div, and this can be the options div. And that way we can append it to a separate div at the bottom. And looping through, and we want to, as we loop through, we've got the option is going to be whatever the question value is. So let's see what that looks like. And actually, this doesn't need to be a div. We can turn them into buttons. So there we've got our question and then all of the possible answers. So we want to make these answers clickable and then be able to check to see if they got it correct. So op1, add an event listener, and the event that we're listening for is going to be a click. So whenever it gets clicked, we just want to do a basic check to see the contents of that element. So for now we can just do a check to see if opt, and remember that's the text on the button, is equal to the question correct answer. And as this is within the parent scope, that's why we can still access that object information. And console log correct, and else, and then we need to still update this to the user so they can see that if they've got it correct or incorrect. And we'll just output wrong. So start the game, and this is the question, and we know which is the correct answer here from the console. So let's select economics, and we see that that's correct. And if we select the other ones, they're coming in wrong. So we still need to randomize the order of the options here. And then once the selection's been made, then what we want to do is we want to disable the buttons. And show whichever one was correct, depending on if the answer is correct or not. And then also move to the next question as the option has been selected. So provide the user an option to move to the next question. So provide a button that will just move to the next question. So let's do that where we'll generate a button. And once this has been selected, then we're going to provide some feedback whether they're right or wrong, and then it'll also add in a button there at the bottom to move to the next question. So once it's been clicked, and we can just run a function that's called next queue. And for this function, next queue, we're going to also need to get the parent of the object. And this is the parent element. So let's generate a button. And just give this a name, but2. So we're connecting it to the parent and generating a new button. And this will say next question. And if button 2 has an event listener, and if it gets clicked, then this is where we can move to the next question. And for now, we'll just write next question into that field. So we click it, and there's our button for the next question, and then that will move us to whatever the next question is. So that can just simply run the output page content if there is a next question. As we've already incremented the page content, so make a selection, next question, make a selection, next question. So that's our basic structure for the trivia database. And coming up next, we're going to apply some styling and then also debug and add some additional functionality to this app. The challenges for this lesson are to make your AJAX request to the Open Trivia database. So get the content that is being requested by the user, so dynamically how many questions they want to select and how many they want to play through, and then build the logical steps for the gameplay from the JSON data, so dynamically generate the question as well as the options for the answers, and then track if the answer is correct or incorrect, and then generate the next steps for the gameplay, allowing the user to move to the next question. And coming up next, we're going to wrap up the application by applying styling and also doing some debugging of the application. So set up your basic quiz structure, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.